Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore had always been particular about appearances. She lived in the grand Victorian house on Elm Street where 3 generations of Whitmores had maintained their reputation for dignity and proper conduct. At 78 years old she still insisted on having her silver hair professionally styled every Tuesday at Beatrice's beauty salon downtown. The routine never varied and Margaret took comfort in the predictability of it all. Her son Robert had done well for himself, very well indeed. The technology company he founded in his garage 25 years ago now employed over 500 people and had made him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. But success had changed Robert in ways that sometimes worried Margaret. He worked too many hours, spent too much time traveling, and seemed to have forgotten the simple pleasures that once brought him joy. Then Sarah came into his life. Sarah Mitchell was not what Margaret had expected for her son's girlfriend. She was 35 to Robert's 42 and worked as a traveling hairstylist serving clients who couldn't easily get to traditional salons. Sarah drove a cheerful yellow van equipped with all the tools of her trade and spent her days visiting nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and the homes of elderly clients who had become her extended family. Margaret had met Sarah only twice before the incident that would change everything. Both meetings had been brief, polite exchanges when Sarah picked up Robert for dinner or dropped him off after an evening out. Margaret found Sarah pleasant enough but couldn't quite understand what drew her successful son to someone whose profession she considered rather ordinary. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. Margaret had woken early as she always did and was preparing for her weekly appointment at Beatrice's when she noticed something troubling in the bathroom mirror. Her carefully maintained silver waves were beginning to show signs of thinning, particularly around her temples where the hair seemed to be pulling away from her scalp in small wispy patches. She touched the areas gently, feeling the tender skin beneath, and wondered if she should mention this to Beatrice. The thought of discussing hair loss filled her with embarrassment. Margaret had always prided herself on maintaining her appearance even as age brought its inevitable changes. The idea that her hair might be failing her felt like a personal defeat. She called Beatrice's salon only to learn that her regular stylist was out sick with the flu. The receptionist suggested rescheduling, but Margaret's routine was too important to her sense of order. She decided to skip the appointment and try to manage her hair herself. By afternoon Margaret was frustrated. Her attempts to style her thinning hair had only made things worse. The patches seemed more noticeable and her usually neat appearance looked disheveled despite her best efforts. She was sitting in her living room feeling defeated when she heard Robert's key in the front door. But instead of Robert entering alone, she heard 2 sets of footsteps and Sarah's gentle voice talking about something she couldn't quite catch. Margaret tried to smooth her hair quickly, but there wasn't time to fix what had gone wrong with her styling attempts. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying a small case and wearing the kind of warm smile that made people feel immediately comfortable. Robert followed close behind, looking pleased about something. "Mother Sarah would like to help you with your hair," Robert announced with the kind of enthusiasm Margaret hadn't heard from him in years. She noticed something that might be causing you some discomfort and wanted to offer her professional assistance. Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The idea that this young woman had noticed her hair troubles felt deeply mortifying. She wasn't used to accepting help, particularly not with something as personal as her appearance. "No thank you dear," Margaret replied stiffly. "I'm sure I can manage." But Sarah had already set down her case and was pulling up a chair. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "I work with many women who are dealing with changes in their hair. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and sometimes a fresh approach can make all the difference. Would you mind if I just took a look?" There was something in Sarah's voice that reminded Margaret of her own mother's gentle way of offering comfort. Despite her resistance, she found herself nodding reluctantly. Sarah's hands were incredibly gentle as she examined Margaret's hair. She asked questions about when Margaret had first noticed the thinning, whether there had been any changes in her health or medications, and what products she typically used. Her touch was professional but also caring in a way that reminded Margaret of the nurses who had cared for her own mother in her final years. "I think we can work with this beautifully," Sarah said after her examination. "The thinning isn't as extensive as you might think, and with the right cut and styling technique we can create fullness and movement that will look completely natural." Margaret wanted to refuse. This wasn't how things were done in her world. Hair appointments happened at proper salons with established professionals, not in living rooms with people she barely knew. But something in Sarah's confident gentle manner made her reconsider. "Very well," she said quietly. "But please be careful." Sarah began by washing Margaret's hair right there in the kitchen sink using a special shampoo she said would add volume. Her technique was different from what Margaret was used to at the salon. Where Beatrice always worked quickly and efficiently, Sarah took her time explaining each step and making sure Margaret was comfortable throughout the process. As Sarah worked, she talked about her other clients. She spoke with genuine affection about Mrs. Chen, who had been a concert pianist and still insisted on having her hair done beautifully even though arthritis had ended her performing days. She told Margaret about Harold, who had been a widower for 10 years but still wanted to look his best because he said his wife was watching from heaven. These stories weren't gossip but gentle tributes to people Sarah clearly cared about. Margaret found herself relaxing as Sarah worked. The young woman's hands were steady and sure, and she seemed to understand instinctively how to work with hair that had become fragile with age. Instead of fighting against the thinning areas, Sarah incorporated them into a style that looked both sophisticated and natural. As the cutting progressed, Margaret became aware that something was happening that she hadn't expected. She was beginning to trust Sarah not just with her hair but with something deeper. The vulnerability she felt about her changing appearance was being met with such genuine understanding that her usual defensiveness began to melt away. Sarah talked quietly as she worked, sharing stories about her grandmother who had taught her that true beauty came from how people treated one another. She spoke about learning to see each client as an individual with their own history and dignity rather than just another head of hair to be styled. Margaret found herself sharing memories of her own mother and grandmother. She told Sarah about the family traditions that had shaped her sense of propriety and the fears she had about growing older in a world that seemed to value youth above experience. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by Sarah's gentle commentary about the progress she was making with the haircut. When Sarah finally put down her scissors and reached for her styling tools, Margaret felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She couldn't see what had been done and wasn't sure she was ready to confront the results. But as Sarah worked the final magic with her brush and styling products, Margaret began to feel different. Not just physically but emotionally. The weight of her worry about her appearance was lifting, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. When Sarah finally turned her toward the mirror, Margaret gasped. The reflection looking back at her was unmistakably herself, but somehow renewed. The style Sarah had created worked with her natural hair patterns rather than against them. The thinning areas had been artfully incorporated into layers that gave her hair movement and life. She looked sophisticated and elegant, but also softer, somehow more approachable than her usual rigid styling. The silver color of her hair caught the light beautifully and her face seemed brighter, framed by the gentle waves Sarah had created. "Oh my," Margaret whispered, touching her hair tentatively. "It's beautiful." Sarah smiled with genuine pleasure at Margaret's reaction. "You have lovely hair, Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "It just needed someone to work with its natural tendencies rather than trying to force it into an unnatural shape." Margaret turned her head from side to side, marveling at how the style moved and caught the light. For the first time in months she felt truly attractive. Not despite her age but in harmony with it. Just then they heard Robert's voice from the front door. He had gone out to run errands while Sarah worked and was returning with groceries for dinner. "Mother," he called. "How are things going in there?" Before Margaret could answer, Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway. His reaction was immediate and powerful. His face went through a series of expressions, starting with surprise and moving quickly to something that looked almost like shock. But it wasn't negative shock. It was the kind of amazement that comes from seeing something unexpectedly wonderful. "Mom," he said softly, "you look absolutely radiant." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been years since anyone had called her radiant. She had begun to think of herself as dignified at best and visible at worst. But looking at her son's face, she could see that he truly meant what he said. Sarah had quietly begun packing up her tools, allowing mother and son to have their moment. But Robert turned to include her in the conversation. "Sarah," he said with deep emotion in his voice, "I don't know how to thank you. You've given my mother something I didn't even realize she was missing." Margaret looked from her son to Sarah, understanding suddenly that something significant had shifted in the dynamic between all of them. Sarah hadn't just cut her hair. She had seen Margaret as a whole person with feelings and fears and dignity that deserved respect. She had offered not just her professional skills but her genuine care. and in doing so she had opened a door that Margaret hadn't even known was closed. "I think," Sarah said with characteristic gentleness, "that your mother has always been radiant. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see it clearly." Over the following weeks Margaret found herself thinking often about that afternoon. The haircut itself was wonderful and she received many compliments from friends and neighbors. But more important was the shift in how she saw herself and how she related to Sarah. Margaret began to understand that her initial judgment of Sarah had been unfair. She had seen only the surface things: Sarah's profession, her age, her casual way of dressing. She hadn't seen the depth of Sarah's character, her genuine gift for making people feel valued and beautiful, or the way she brought out the best in Robert. Margaret started inviting Sarah for coffee when she came to pick up Robert. These visits became longer and more meaningful as the two women discovered they had more in common than either had expected. Sarah's grandmother had been much like Margaret, traditional in many ways but also fiercely independent. Margaret's own journey from small-town girl to successful businessman's wife had required more adaptability than she usually let people see. They talked about the challenges of maintaining dignity while embracing change, about the difference between vanity and self-respect, about what it meant to age gracefully in a world that often dismissed older women. Margaret began to see that Sarah's work was about much more than cutting hair. She was in the business of helping people feel valued and beautiful at vulnerable moments in their lives. It was a calling that required not just technical skill but emotional intelligence and genuine compassion. The relationship between Robert and Sarah deepened too. Margaret could see that her son was more relaxed and happy than he had been in years. Sarah brought out a gentleness in him that Margaret remembered from his childhood. She encouraged him to slow down, to appreciate simple pleasures, to reconnect with the parts of himself that success and responsibility had pushed aside. One evening several months after the haircut, Robert brought Sarah for dinner. As they sat around Margaret's dining table sharing stories and laughing together, Margaret realized that her family had grown. Not through formal ceremonies or legal documents but through the quiet accumulation of trust and affection. Sarah had become like a daughter to her, the daughter she had never had but had always secretly wanted. When it came time for Sarah to leave that evening, Margaret walked her to the door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for the haircut but for helping me see that getting older doesn't have to mean becoming invisible." Sarah hugged her warmly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you were never invisible. You just needed someone who knew how to look." Margaret watched from her window as Sarah and Robert drove away together. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman whose hair was still beautifully styled months after that transformative afternoon. But more than that, it showed a woman who had learned that true beauty comes not from fighting against change but from embracing it with grace and openness to unexpected blessings. The haircut had been just the beginning. What followed was a lesson in the power of kindness to transform not just appearances but relationships, and the courage to be vulnerable enough to accept help from unexpected sources. Margaret touched her hair gently, remembering the feel of Sarah's careful hands and the sound of her gentle voice. She had thought she was too old to learn new lessons about trust and family and beauty. She had been wonderfully wrong.